Ukraine is fighting for its life, but a stunning betrayal may be brewing in Alaska. While Ukrainian forces battle Russian invaders on the front lines, President Trump is preparing to sit down with Vladimir Putin in what could become the most consequential summit in decades, and the early signs are terrifying for Ukraine.
President Donald Trump at the White House just moments ago saying that he will soon announce details of a meeting with Russian President Vladimir Putin.
We're going to be announcing later on, we're going to have a meeting with Russia. We'll start off with Russia, and we'll announce a location. I think the location will be a very popular one for a lot of reasons.
Now, those comments come the same exact day that Trump's self-imposed deadline was set to expire. He had told President Putin to come to the table to end the war in Ukraine, prepare to face punishing sanctions. We start things off with CNN's Kristen Holmes from the North Lawn in the White House. Kristen, we are standing by for more details on this meeting that is supposed to be announced later today. But the president had a lot to say about the dynamics at that event. What else did he say?
The announcement came suddenly, catching even seasoned diplomats off guard. What was supposed to be an ultimatum deadline for Putin turned into something entirely different. Instead of imposing the threatened sanctions, we're witnessing preparations for a historic meeting on American soil. This will be Putin's first visit to U.S. soil in nearly a decade, and it's happening under circumstances that heavily favor Moscow. The symbolism alone is striking. Alaska, the territory Russia sold to America for $7.2 million in 1867, is now the venue where Putin hopes to convince Trump to accept his land grab of the century. Think about that for a moment. We're talking about a meeting in former Russian territory to discuss giving current Ukrainian territory to Russia. The optics couldn't be worse for Ukraine. When pressed about specifics, the response was revealing.
Would Russia wanted that would have Ukraine cede some of its territory to Russia. Of course, as we know, Ukraine has not in any way, they've said that they would not agree to anything in which they ceded territory. He did not say no. When asked about this, if that was in a plan, instead he kind of danced around it. He said that this is territory that they've fought over for 3.5 years, that a lot of Russians have died, and then he added a lot of Ukrainians have died. And then he said, we're going to be looking to give some territories back, to swap some territories, and then he called it very complicated. Now, very complicated to say the least. This is incredibly complicated, and there are a lot of sides.
The situation was described as very complicated, with territories that have been fought over for 3.5 years. The suggestion of territorial exchanges has sent shockwaves through diplomatic circles. What exactly would Ukraine get back in this proposed arrangement? Analysts suggest Ukraine might regain tiny slivers of border areas in Sumy and Kharkiv regions that are part of Putin's so-called buffer zone. But in exchange, Russia would likely keep the massive territories it has seized, including parts of 4 Ukrainian regions Putin illegally annexed in 2022, plus Crimea, which Russia grabbed in 2014. The reaction from Ukraine has been swift and
vividly brings back memories about Munich 1938, because we have very similar situation. First of all, the fate of the country, which is a victim of aggression, is being decided by 2 great powers without participation of this country. So it's a very dangerous situation for Ukraine. And Ukraine should also participate, the president of Ukraine should also participate in these negotiations. And the second big issue, which is reminiscent of Munich 1938, is related to the fact that the aggressor can be rewarded, not punished, for the crime of aggression and for occupation of the territories. It's extremely dangerous situation, not only for Ukraine, but also for international law and for the whole world.
So what about these talks? It is, of course, reports locally, or rather within the US at the moment via CBS, that in terms of territory, that could be swapped, as President Trump said. We're talking about Kherson, Zaporizhia, the Donbass. What's the country's feeling on that? What's the country's
defiant? As the message from Kiev is crystal clear: Ukrainians will not give their land to occupiers. The Ukrainian position emphasizes that any decisions made without Ukraine's involvement are decisions against peace. These are seen as dead solutions that will never work. The constitutional and moral implications are enormous, This isn't a swap, it's a surrender disguised as diplomacy.
Україна готова до реальних рішень, які можуть дати мир. Будь-які рішення, які проти нас, будь-які рішення, які без України, вони одночасно і рішення проти миру. Вони нічого не дадуть. Це мертві рішення. Вони ніколи не спрацюють. А нам усім потрібен реальний, живий мир. Відповідь на українське територіальне питання є вже в Конституції України. Відступати від цього ніхто не буде і не зможе. Дарувати свою землю окупанту українці не будуть. Ми готові разом з президентом Трампом, разом з усіма нашими партнерами працювати заради реального і, головне, тривалого миру. Миру, який не розвалиться через бажання Москви.
The fundamental problem with this approach becomes clear when you examine what's actually being discussed. We're not talking about exchanging Russian territory for Ukrainian territory. We're talking about Ukraine potentially accepting the loss of lands that hundreds of thousands have died defending. But the Ukrainian leader faces a nightmare scenario. He's being excluded from the initial summit, despite the war being fought on his country's territory with his people's blood. The suggestion that he might be called after the main meeting, essentially treating the Ukrainian president as a junior partner who gets briefed on decisions made about his country's future, reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of what's at stake. The White House is now considering various options for Ukrainian participation, but it's unclear if meaningful inclusion is even possible at this stage. This reflects the fundamental problem, treating this like a real estate negotiation between two parties, when in reality it's about the survival of a democratic nation under unprovoked attack. Remember, this is the same Trump who sided with Putin over U.S. intelligence agencies in Helsinki in
24 hours. They don't think that. Remember, this is swapping Ukrainian territory for Ukrainian territory, not Russian territory. And that the president so flippantly said, this is what we're going to talk about without the Ukrainians in the room, I just think is undermining his own ability to mediate an end to this horrific war. And I always say I applaud his efforts to be engaged and to try to end this war. But the strategy that he's adopted so far, I don't think advances the objective of ending the war. And contrary, if he walks out of a press conference and says, I've just agreed to give away this and that piece of Ukraine to Putin, that will set back the peace process, not advance it.
And also his lack of adherence to timelines, right?
2018. That moment, when Putin's denials about election interference were described as extremely strong and powerful, still haunts American foreign policy. It's the same pattern of praising Putin's intelligence and leadership skills. Can this approach really stand up to Putin when Ukrainian territory and European security hang in the balance? Putin, meanwhile, is playing this perfectly from his perspective.
Would you now, with the whole world watching, tell President Putin, would you denounce what happened in 2016, and would you warn him to never do it again?
So I have great confidence in my intelligence people, but I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
The diplomatic gift of a presidential meeting on American soil is extraordinary. Russian officials are celebrating landing this summit without making any meaningful concessions. Putin hasn't agreed to a ceasefire, hasn't withdrawn troops, and hasn't stopped bombing Ukrainian cities. Yet he's being rewarded with something every world leader desires, FaceTime with an American president. This sends a powerful message about American priorities and the potential rewards for aggression. The timing is also significant. This summit comes just as Ukraine was making gains with its long-range strike capabilities. Ukrainian drones hitting targets deep inside Russia represent a major shift in the war's dynamics. These operations force Russia to defend its own territory rather than just attacking Ukraine, stretching Russian resources and exposing the vulnerability of Putin's war machine. But the eagerness to cut a deal may undermine Ukraine's growing advantages. By rushing into negotiations while Putin feels he has the upper hand, there's a risk of legitimizing Russian territorial gains and rewarding aggression. The European response has been telling.
Remember, when we worked together at the White House, anytime a foreign leader meets with the president of the United States, that's a gift. That it is Vladimir Putin that can't travel to a lot of countries because he's a criminal, and that he gets to come to the United States of America and stand next to the president of the United States is a gift. He's already received everything he needs. The question, therefore, for President Trump and his team, what are we getting in return for America's national interests, for Europe's interests, and for Ukraine's interests? And so far, the details on that are very murky. The clip you just played about swaps, you're absolutely right. He's talking about swapping Ukrainian land for Ukrainian land. He's not talking about Russian land being swapped. And I can tell you the reaction in Ukraine among officials, this feels very nervous. They're very nervous about this, especially because President Zelensky's not going to be in Alaska. It's just going to be Putin and Trump.
I mean, I think that is for Trump being played, that is part of it. But what happens next week at this meeting, and where does it go, to your point? I mean, Putin told the Trump administration this week that Russia would agree to a ceasefire of Ukraine if Ukraine handed over eastern Ukraine, which would be an absurd thing for them to do. But is that kind of a fear? Is that something that you think is possible in this meeting, that Trump could potentially agree to that?
The message from European capitals is unified and clear. International borders must not be changed by force. This wasn't just diplomatic language, it was a direct warning not to accept Putin's territorial demands. The concern runs deep, with parallels being drawn to historical moments when appeasement failed catastrophically. German officials are particularly worried, with some describing Putin's summit proposal as part of the war itself.
European allies of Ukraine have called for more pressure on Russia ahead of Friday's summit between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. The group, which includes Britain, France and Germany, said Ukraine must be involved in decisions about a path to peace. Overnight, they issued a joint statement saying the path to peace in Ukraine cannot be decided without Ukraine, adding, "We remain committed to the principle that international borders must not be changed by force." Well, President Zelensky, who's already ruled out handing over any land to Russia in exchange for peace, has been consulting his European allies in the lead-up to Friday's talks in Alaska.
The comparison to Munich 1938 is not made lightly. European leaders see this as Putin's attempt to get through diplomacy what he couldn't achieve through military force. International recognition of his territorial conquests and a weakened, divided Ukraine unable to join NATO. The fear is that rewarding the aggressor sets a precedent that undermines the entire international order. The strategic implications extend far beyond Ukraine. If a deal is accepted that rewards Putin's aggression with territorial gains, it sends a message to every authoritarian leader worldwide that military conquest can be legitimized through patient diplomacy. China's approach to Taiwan, for instance, would be directly influenced by how this Ukraine situation resolves. Putin's maximalist demands haven't changed since the war began. He wants all Ukrainian territory his forces currently occupy. He wants guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO, and he wants Ukraine to remain within Russia's sphere of influence permanently. These aren't the demands of someone interested in genuine peace. They're the demands of someone seeking total victory through other means. The military situation on the ground also factors into Putin's negotiating position. Russian forces have been making gradual advances along the 1,000-kilometer front, and Putin believes time is on his side. Ukrainian forces are struggling with manpower shortages and ammunition constraints, despite continued Western support. But Putin may be miscalculating. The Ukrainian military has shown remarkable adaptability and resilience. Their drone program represents just one example of how Ukraine has innovated under pressure. Ukrainian forces have also demonstrated that they can hold defensive positions effectively when properly equipped and supported. The real question is whether the gravity of the situation is fully understood. This isn't just about ending a war, it's about the future of international law, democratic values, and the post-World War II order that has prevented major power conflicts for nearly 8 decades. The framing of this as a feel-out meeting where Putin's seriousness about peace will be assessed raises concerns. The claim that it will be immediately apparent whether a deal is possible and the readiness to walk away if Putin isn't genuinely interested in ending the war sounds reassuring, but the track record raises questions about the ability to take a hard line when it matters. The Alaska Summit also raises questions about American credibility with allies. European leaders have invested enormous political capital in supporting Ukraine, often at significant economic cost to their own countries. If a deal is now cut that abandons core principles about territorial integrity and self-determination, it would fundamentally damage America's relationships with its closest allies. Ukrainian soldiers on the front lines are watching these developments with deep concern. After nearly 3 years of fighting, after losing friends and family members to Russian aggression, the prospect of being forced to surrender territory through diplomatic pressure is devastating. Many Ukrainian forces believe there's no end in sight to this war other than a brief respite before Moscow resumes attacks with even greater force. This reflects a fundamental misunderstanding in the approach. Putin isn't interested in genuine peace. He's interested in a pause that allows him to rearm, regroup, and resume his imperial project when conditions are more favorable. Any ceasefire that leaves Russian forces in occupied Ukrainian territory is essentially a timeout that favors the aggressor. The international legal implications are also staggering. If the United States, as the leader of the international order, accepts that borders can be changed through force and then legitimized through negotiation, it undermines every treaty, every alliance, and every principle that has maintained global stability since 1945. As we head toward Friday's summit, the stakes couldn't be higher. This isn't just about Ukraine anymore. It's about whether the international community will stand by its stated principles or abandon them for the promise of short-term peace. Putin is betting that the desire to be seen as a dealmaker will override America's commitment to its allies and values. The outcome of this summit will reverberate for generations. If Putin gets what he wants, territorial gains legitimized through American acceptance, it will mark the beginning of a new era where military conquest becomes an acceptable tool of statecraft once again. But if there's a firm stand on principles of territorial integrity and Ukrainian self-determination, it could mark the beginning of Putin's strategic defeat. Ukraine's future, Europe's security, and America's credibility all hang in the balance. The world will be watching Alaska very closely on Friday because what happens there may determine whether we're entering an era of renewed great power competition or whether the rules-based international order can survive its greatest test since World War II. The Ukrainian people have shown extraordinary courage in defending their homeland. Now the question is whether their supposed allies will show the same courage in defending the principles that make their sacrifice meaningful. Friday's summit will provide the answer, and Ukraine's future, and perhaps our own, depends on getting it right.